The static-filled radio crackled through the operations tent as General Morrison stared at the tactical display, his weathered face illuminated by the amber glow of computer screens. 23 aircraft had launched at dawn. 22 had returned. The missing blip on the radar belonged to Warthog 77, call sign Banshee, piloted by Captain Raven Blackwood. Morrison's jaw tightened as he reached for the radio handset, the weight of command pressing down on his shoulders like lead armor. "This is Overwatch to all stations," his gravelly voice carried across the frequency. "Banshee is presumed KIA. Effective immediately, search and rescue operations are suspended due to heavy enemy activity in Sector 7 Alpha." The words felt like broken glass in his throat, but 40 years of military service had taught him that hope was a luxury commanders couldn't afford when lives hung in the balance. Staff Sergeant Elena Rodriguez looked up from her communications console, her dark eyes flashing with barely contained fury. She had been Blackwood's crew chief for 3 years, had watched the woman transform from an eager flight school graduate into one of the most lethal close air support pilots in the theater. Rodriguez knew something the general didn't: Raven Blackwood didn't die easy. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the Warthog, wasn't built for beauty. It was built to take punishment and keep flying. Its titanium bathtub could withstand direct hits from anti-aircraft fire, its redundant systems could function with half the aircraft shot away, and its massive GAU-8 Avenger rotary cannon could turn enemy armor into scrap metal from miles away. If anyone could survive what happened over the valley that morning, it would be Blackwood. But the intelligence reports painted a grim picture. The mission had gone sideways when what should have been a routine close air support run turned into a hornet's nest of surface-to-air missiles and small arms fire. Blackwood had been covering the extraction of a pinned-down special operations team when her aircraft disappeared from radar, last seen diving through a wall of flak at treeline level. Morrison set down the handset and turned away from the display. In the corner of the tent, Master Sergeant Jake "Wrench" Peterson, the squadron's maintenance chief, methodically cleaned his hands with a shop rag, his movements deliberate and controlled. He had been working on aircraft longer than most of these pilots had been alive, and he recognized the look in Rodriguez's eyes. It was the same look he'd seen in the mirror every time they lost a bird. Outside, the desert wind carried the smell of jet fuel and dust, mixing with the distant rumble of artillery. The war would continue, missions would be flown, and young men and women would climb into cockpits knowing that not all of them would come home. But somewhere in the back of Morrison's mind, a small voice whispered what Rodriguez already knew: Raven Blackwood was still out there. The afternoon sun blazed mercilessly over forward operating Base Viper, as mechanics wheeled damaged aircraft into hangars like broken birds seeking shelter. The base hummed with the controlled chaos of military operations, fuel trucks rumbling past ammunition depots, pilots walking the flight line in sweat-stained flight suits, and radio operators managing an endless stream of communications traffic. But beneath the routine efficiency, an undercurrent of tension rippled through the ranks like electricity before a storm. Captain Marcus Torch Sullivan pulled off his helmet and ran his fingers through sweat-matted hair as he climbed down from his A-10's cockpit. His aircraft bore fresh scars from the morning's mission, bullet holes stitched across the left wing, a cracked canopy, and hydraulic fluid slowly dripping onto the tarmac like mechanical blood. He had been Blackwood's wingman, the last person to see her aircraft before it vanished into the maze of canyons and ridgelines that defined Sector 7 Alpha. "She was right behind me," Sullivan muttered to Peterson as the maintenance chief inspected the damage. "One second she was there, lighting up that convoy the next." He trailed off, staring at the empty hardstand where Blackwood's Warthog should have been parked. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the distant whine of jet engines and the metallic ping of cooling metal. Rodriguez emerged from the communications bunker, her face grave. "Still nothing on the emergency frequencies," she reported to Morrison, who stood with his arms crossed, studying weather reports that showed a sandstorm building on the horizon. Search and rescue is grounded until the weather clears, but even then, she didn't need to finish. Everyone knew that Sector 7 Alpha was crawling with enemy forces, and a downed pilot's chances of survival decreased exponentially with each passing hour. The general's decision to declare Blackwood KIA wasn't cruelty. It was pragmatism born from decades of watching good people disappear into the fog of war. He had seen too many rescue operations turn into disasters, too many lives lost chasing ghosts in hostile territory. But as he watched his people struggle with the loss, Morrison couldn't shake the memory of Blackwood's first day in theater 6 months ago. She had stepped off the transport aircraft with that peculiar mixture of confidence and uncertainty that marked all new pilots. Her service record was impressive but unremarkable, middle of her class at flight school, no disciplinary actions, solid performance marks, but nothing that suggested exceptional ability. She was just another face in the endless rotation of young officers who passed through his command. What Morrison hadn't expected was the quiet intensity that burned behind her steel-gray eyes, or the way she seemed to absorb every lesson like parched earth soaking up rain. While other pilots spent their off-duty hours playing video games or writing letters home, Blackwood could be found studying terrain maps, memorizing radio frequencies, and questioning veteran pilots about combat tactics with the persistence of a scholar. The desert wind picked up, sending dust devils dancing across the flight line as the first hints of the approaching storm darkened the horizon. The briefing room fell silent as Major Lisa Viper Chang finished her tactical assessment of the morning's mission. Satellite imagery displayed on the wall screen showed the aftermath: smoking vehicles scattered across a mountain pass, the charred remains of an enemy convoy that had been attempting to resupply insurgent forces in the northern provinces. It had been a textbook close air support mission right up until the moment everything went to hell. Chang highlighted a section of the map with her laser pointer. Intelligence indicates heavy SAM activity in this sector. Multiple launch signatures were detected during the engagement, consistent with shoulder-fired and vehicle-mounted surface-to-air missiles. Her voice remained professionally neutral, but Sullivan could hear the underlying tension. Chang had planned the mission, selected the approach routes, calculated the risks. Now one of her pilots was missing. Banshee's last confirmed position was here, Chang continued, marking a narrow valley between two ridgelines. She was making her third pass on the convoy when we lost contact. Torch, you were in position to observe. Walk me through what you saw. Sullivan stood, his flight suit still bearing salt stains from dried sweat. She had just rolled in on the eastern flank of the convoy. I saw her GAU-8 firing good hits on what looked like a supply truck. Then the whole valley lit up with muzzle flashes, small arms, machine guns. Looked like they had dug in positions we didn't know about. He paused, seeing it again in his mind's eye. I was engaging targets on the western side when I heard her call, Fox 2. She was taking defensive action against a SAM launch. The room remained quiet except for the hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of aircraft engines. Fox 2 meant she had fired a flare to decoy an incoming missile, standard defensive procedure that every pilot had drilled countless times in training. But training was sterile, predictable. Combat was chaos wrapped in violence and seasoned with terror. That's when the smoke started, Sullivan continued. Thick black smoke rising from the valley floor. I called for her to check in but got nothing but static. By the time I made another pass, the whole area was socked in with smoke and dust. Visibility was zero. Rodriguez had been listening from the back of the room, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "What about the emergency beacon?" she asked, though she already knew the answer. Modern aircraft were equipped with automatic emergency locating transmitters that activated when the pilot ejected or the aircraft experienced catastrophic damage. The fact that no beacon signal had been detected suggested either Blackwood had gone down hard and fast, or she was deliberately maintaining radio silence to avoid detection. "Nothing," Chang confirmed. No beacon, no radio contact, no secondary radar return. The aircraft essentially vanished. She clicked to the next slide, showing weather data. The sandstorm will reach our position in 6 hours and persist for at least 12. Ground search operations are impossible until it passes. Morrison entered the briefing room as Chang finished her presentation. His presence commanded immediate attention, the kind of authority that came from leading men and women in combat for longer than some of them had been alive. The sandstorm arrived with the fury of an angry god, turning day to night and reducing visibility to mere feet. Inside the reinforced concrete buildings of Fob Viper, personnel went about their duties with practiced efficiency, but everyone could feel the storm's presence, a constant pressure against the walls, the howl of wind that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Outside, the world had been erased by swirling curtains of sand and grit that could strip paint from vehicles and scour exposed skin raw. In the communications bunker, Rodriguez maintained her vigil over the radio equipment, headphones clamped over her ears as she methodically cycled through emergency frequencies. Static filled the spectrum like electronic snow, but she listened anyway, hopping to catch some fragment of transmission that might indicate Blackwood was still alive. The storm created a communications blackout that extended for hundreds of miles, turning the entire theater into an electronic dead zone. Peterson worked by the light of portable lamps in Hangar 3, his weathered hands moving over aircraft components with the sure touch of a master craftsman. The scheduled maintenance couldn't wait for perfect weather, and he used the forced downtime to catch up on repairs that had been deferred due to high operational tempo. As he worked, he thought about Blackwood's aircraft. Warthog 77 had been one of his best birds, a reliable performer with over 2,000 combat hours on the airframe. He remembered the day she had first walked into his hangar, still smelling of jet fuel and nervous energy from her cross-country flight to the theater. Most pilots treated maintenance personnel like furniture, present but largely invisible. Blackwood had introduced herself, asked about the aircraft's history, wanted to know about any quirks or characteristics that might affect performance. It was a small thing, but it had impressed the old master sergeant. "She treats that bird like it's alive," Peterson had told Rodriguez after Blackwood's first combat mission. "Talks to it during pre-flight, thanks it after landing. Sounds crazy, but pilots who think that way tend to bring their aircraft home in one piece." The storm raged on, and with each passing hour, the statistical probability of Blackwood's survival decreased. Military doctrine was clear on the subject. A pilot's chances of evading capture or surviving in hostile territory dropped dramatically after the first 24 hours. Environmental factors, dehydration, injury, and enemy search parties all conspired against survival. Yet Rodriguez continued her radio watch. Peterson continued working on aircraft that might never fly again, and Sullivan stared at weather reports that showed no sign of the storm weakening. In his quarters, Morrison reviewed personnel files by lamplight, studying the service records of pilots under his command. Blackwood's file was thinner than most. She had only been in theater for 6 months, but her performance ratings showed steady improvement. Her instructors at flight school had noted her as competent but unremarkable, a phrase that damned with faint praise in the military's assessment system. What the file didn't capture was the transformation Morrison had witnessed. The uncertain young officer who had arrived in the desert had evolved into something harder, sharper. She flew with a precision that bordered on artistry, delivered ordnance with surgical accuracy, and never seemed to rattle under pressure. The storm howled its fury against the walls, and somewhere in that maelstrom of sand and wind, Raven Blackwood was either fighting for survival or already gone. Dawn came reluctantly, filtered through layers of dust that hung in the air like a brown curtain. The storm had passed, leaving behind a transformed landscape where familiar landmarks had been buried under fresh drifts of sand, and the flight line looked like an archaeological site waiting to be excavated. Ground crews emerged from shelters like survivors of some natural disaster, squinting against the pale light as they began the process of digging out aircraft and equipment. Peterson surveyed the damage with the stoic acceptance of a man who had weathered dozens of such storms. Sand had found its way into every conceivable space: engine intakes, cockpit vents, ammunition bays. Each aircraft would require hours of cleaning and inspection before it could be declared mission-ready. But as he walked the flight line, his experienced eye noted something that made him pause. The empty hardstand where Blackwood's A-10 should have been parked showed signs of recent disturbance, tracks in the sand that couldn't be explained by the storm alone. Rodriguez emerged from the communications bunker, her face haggard from 24 hours of fruitless monitoring. The storm had passed, but the communications blackout persisted, sporadic at best and completely unreliable for anything beyond basic transmissions. She had managed to raise a few scattered outposts, but none had any information about Blackwood or her aircraft. The sound of rotor blades cutting through the morning air announced the arrival of a medical evacuation helicopter, its distinctive profile silhouetted against the dust-laden sky. The aircraft settled onto the designated landing pad with practiced precision, kicking up clouds of fine sand that set everyone within 100 yards coughing and covering their faces. The crew chief jumped down and jogged toward the operations tent, a message pouch clutched in his gloved hand. Morrison met the crew chief halfway, accepting the pouch with the grim efficiency of a commander who had received too many such deliveries. Inside were intelligence reports, casualty updates, and operational orders that would shape the next phase of their mission. But tucked among the official documents was a single sheet of paper that made him stop and read twice, his weathered features creasing into something that might have been surprise. "Rodriguez," he called out, his voice carrying across the flight line with unmistakable urgency. "Get me a complete frequency scan of all emergency channels. Expand the search radius to include the northern valleys." The staff sergeant looked puzzled but nodded, already moving toward the communications equipment. After 30 years of working with Morrison, she had learned to trust his instincts even when his orders didn't make immediate sense. Sullivan was helping ground crews clear sand from his aircraft's engine intakes when he saw Morrison's expression. The general wasn't a man given to emotional displays, but something in his bearing suggested a significant development. Other personnel had noticed as well. Conversations died away as attention focused on the operations tent, where Morrison was spreading maps across a portable table and making rapid calculations with a slide rule that had seen decades of use. The medical helicopter crew had brought more than just official dispatches. They had carried rumors, fragments of radio transmissions, and second-hand reports from forward observation posts that painted a picture of continued resistance in Sector 7 Alpha. Enemy forces that should have been disrupted by the previous day's airstrikes were reportedly still active, still moving supplies through the mountain passes. Something was wrong with the intelligence picture, but Morrison couldn't quite identify what bothered him about the reports. The revelation came not from sophisticated intelligence analysis or satellite reconnaissance, but from a conversation overheard in the mess tent between two infantry soldiers who had been part of the special operations team that Blackwood had been supporting when she disappeared. They spoke in the casual shorthand of combat veterans, their words carrying the weight of shared experience and mutual respect. "That Warthog pilot saved our asses," Private First Class Danny Williams was saying as he stirred sugar into coffee that looked strong enough to dissolve metal. "We were pinned down in that valley, taking fire from 3 directions, when she came screaming in at about 50 feet off the deck. Never seen flying like that, threading the needle between those ridgelines like she was born to it." His companion, Sergeant Tommy Brooks, nodded grimly. "She made at least 4 passes, maybe 5. Each time she'd come in from a different angle, hammer the positions that were giving us the most trouble, then disappear behind the ridgeline before their SAMs could lock on. Professional as hell." Rodriguez had been passing their table when she heard the conversation, and something in their tone made her stop and listen more carefully. The official reports indicated that Blackwood had been shot down during her third pass on the convoy, but these soldiers were describing a much longer engagement, multiple attack runs that suggested tactical expertise far beyond what anyone had expected from the quiet pilot. "What happened to her?" Rodriguez asked, pulling up a chair without invitation. Military protocol usually discouraged enlisted personnel from inserting themselves into conversations between soldiers from different units, but the circumstances warranted flexibility. Williams looked up, recognizing the crew chief's insignia on Rodriguez's uniform. "You work on the Warthogs." When she nodded, his expression grew serious. "That pilot of yours is something else. We were taking casualties, couldn't move forward or back, and the radio was full of panic. Then we hear this calm voice on the frequency, cool as ice water, asking for our exact position and the location of enemy fire." Brooks picked up the story. She didn't just dump ordnance and leave, she worked the problem like a chess master. Hit their command post first to disrupt communications, then systematically went after their heavy weapons positions. By the time she finished, we could move freely through that entire valley. "But she went down," Rodriguez said, though something in the soldier's manner suggested the story wasn't over. "That's where it gets interesting," Williams continued, lowering his voice as though sharing classified information. "We were moving to our extraction point when we heard jet engines again, low and fast, coming from the north. Couldn't see the aircraft through all the smoke, but it sounded like an A-10, throttles firewalled, heading away from the contact area." Rodriguez felt her pulse quicken. "You think she made it out?" "Don't know for sure," Brooks admitted. "But whoever was flying that bird was hauling ass toward the northern mountains, and they weren't on the radio asking for directions." The implications hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. If Blackwood had survived the engagement and was attempting to return to base, she would need to navigate hundreds of miles of hostile territory in a damaged aircraft. The pieces of the puzzle began falling into place as Rodriguez shared the soldier's account with Morrison and the rest of the command staff. The intelligence reports that had seemed contradictory now made perfect sense. Enemy forces in Sector 7 Alpha weren't regrouping after being disrupted by airstrikes. They were actively hunting for a downed pilot. The increased radio chatter, the movement of search teams, the concentration of forces in areas that should have been abandoned, it all pointed to one conclusion. Raven Blackwood was alive, and the enemy knew it. Chang pulled up tactical displays showing the terrain between Sector 7 Alpha and Fob Viper, her fingers tracing possible flight paths across the digital map. "If she's trying to make it back, she'd have to fly through at least 3 SAM-defended areas and avoid multiple radar installations. In a damaged aircraft at low altitude, it's virtually impossible." "Unless she knows something we don't," Morrison said quietly, studying intelligence reports that suddenly seemed inadequate. The official assessment had dismissed the northern route as impassable due to terrain and enemy presence, but military doctrine was written by committees in air-conditioned offices. Combat pilots learned different lessons, adapted different techniques. Peterson joined the discussion from his position near the maintenance boards, where colored markers tracked the status of every aircraft in the squadron. 7-7 was configured for extended operations, he reported. External fuel tanks, extended-range ammunition load, survival equipment rated for 72 hours minimum. If the bird's still flyable, she's got options we haven't considered. The search parameters were immediately expanded to include the northern approaches, but the logistics were daunting. The area encompassed thousands of square miles of mountainous terrain, much of it controlled by enemy forces that had spent years learning to hide from aerial reconnaissance. Traditional search and rescue operations would require massive resources and carry enormous risks. But Rodriguez had an idea that bordered on desperation. She had been Blackwood's crew chief long enough to understand how the pilot thought, had seen her study maps and memorize terrain features with an intensity that went beyond standard preparation. Blackwood didn't just fly missions, she absorbed them, internalized every detail until she could navigate by instinct alone. "She won't take the obvious routes," Rodriguez said, moving to the map display. "Blackwood studies terrain like other people study textbooks. She knows every canyon, every ridgeline, every place where radar coverage has gaps." Her finger traced a path through seemingly impossible terrain, following valleys and canyons that twisted through the mountains like a three-dimensional maze. "That route would require flying at extreme low altitude," Chang observed. "In a damaged aircraft with limited fuel, the margin for error would be virtually zero." Sullivan had been listening from the back of the room, and now he stepped forward with the particular intensity that marked pilots who had suddenly grasped a crucial tactical concept. "She's not trying to avoid detection," he said slowly. "She's using the terrain to mask her approach. Classic nap-of-the-earth flying, but applied to strategic movement instead of tactical engagement." The realization transformed their understanding of the situation, shifting focus from search and rescue to something more complex. The waiting became a physical presence in the operations center, thick and oppressive like humidity before a thunderstorm. Morrison found himself checking his watch every few minutes, calculating flight times and fuel consumption rates with the obsessive precision of a man whose decisions meant life or death for the personnel under his command. If Blackwood was indeed attempting to navigate the northern route, she should have reached friendly airspace hours ago. Rodriguez maintained her vigil at the radio station, systematically monitoring every frequency that an aircraft in distress might use. The post-storm atmospheric conditions created unpredictable propagation effects, allowing some signals to carry for hundreds of miles while others faded within a few dozen. She adjusted antenna settings, fine-tuned receivers, and listened to static with the focused attention of a priest at prayer. The first hint came not from the radio, but from a seismic monitoring station located 50 miles north of the base. The automated system detected a low-frequency signature consistent with jet engines operating at high-power settings, but the signal was too brief and too distant for positive identification. Within minutes, similar reports arrived from 3 other monitoring stations, creating a rough triangulation that placed an unidentified aircraft somewhere in the northern mountains. "Could be anything," Chang cautioned as they plotted the reported positions on their tactical display. "Supply aircraft, enemy fighters, even atmospheric effects causing false readings." But her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. Peterson appeared in the operations center carrying a folder thick with maintenance records and technical specifications. "I've been going through 7-7 service history," he announced, setting the documents on Morrison's desk. "That bird's been through hell and back, took a direct hit from a rocket-propelled grenade in April, caught fire over the eastern provinces in May, and had hydraulic failure during a mission in June. Each time, Blackwood brought her home." The maintenance records painted a picture of an aircraft that had been tested beyond its design limits, patched and repaired and sent back into combat with the mechanical equivalent of scar tissue holding it together. But they also showed something else, a pattern of modifications and adjustments that suggested both pilot and crew chief understood the machine's capabilities better than its original designers. "She's flying a wounded bird through impossible terrain," Sullivan said, voicing what everyone was thinking. "Even if she makes it through the mountains, she'll still need to get past the outer defensive perimeter without being shot down by our own people." The identification procedures were complex for good reason. The airspace around military installations was defended by surface-to-air missiles and fighter aircraft that responded to unidentified contacts with lethal efficiency. A damaged aircraft approaching from an unexpected direction, possibly unable to communicate normally, would trigger automatic defensive responses that could destroy it before its identity was established. Morrison was already reaching for his secure phone, preparing to contact air defense units throughout the region. If Blackwood was coming home, he intended to make sure she had a clear path to the runway. But as he lifted the handset, Rodriguez suddenly straightened at her monitoring station, pressing her headphones tighter against her ears. "Wait," she said, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "I'm getting something on guard frequency, weak signal, lots of interference, but definitely aircraft-related." She adjusted her equipment frantically, trying to clarify the transmission. The sound that emerged from the speakers was barely recognizable as human communication, a mixture of static, engine noise, and a voice so distorted by fatigue and electronic interference that individual words were almost impossible to distinguish. But Rodriguez had spent 3 years learning to recognize every nuance of Blackwood's radio technique, and something in the rhythm of the transmission made her pulse race. The identification code came through clearly enough, 3 groups of numbers that confirmed what everyone hoped but hadn't dared believe. Warthog 77 was approaching friendly airspace, requesting immediate clearance for emergency landing. The aircraft was heavily damaged, low on fuel, and the pilot was requesting emergency medical personnel to be standing by. But it was the final part of the transmission that sent a chill through everyone listening. Blackwood reported that she was carrying critical intelligence about enemy positions and capabilities that required immediate debriefing at the highest levels of command. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within minutes, emergency crews were racing toward the runway, medical personnel were preparing trauma equipment, and Morrison was coordinating with air traffic control to clear all other aircraft from the approach pattern. Fighter escorts launched to provide protection during the final approach, and every radar operator in the theater was focused on guiding the damaged Warthog safely home. Peterson grabbed his emergency toolkit and sprinted toward the flight line, knowing that whatever condition 77 was in, she would need immediate attention to remain flyable. Rodriguez continued monitoring the radio, maintaining contact with Blackwood as her aircraft limped closer to base. The transmissions were sporadic and often garbled, but they painted a picture of an aircraft operating on the edge of catastrophic failure. "Hydraulic system is gone, electrical system is marginal, and I'm showing multiple warning lights," Blackwood reported during one of the clearer transmissions. "But the engines are still running and I've got enough fuel for one approach. Request straighten landing, runway 27. Chang was coordinating with the tower, ensuring that emergency equipment would be positioned for immediate response. Crash trucks, ambulances, and fire suppression vehicles were already moving into position, their crews preparing for the possibility that the landing attempt might end in disaster. Sullivan stood at the edge of the runway, binoculars raised toward the northern horizon where a tiny speck was gradually resolving into the familiar silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt. Even at this distance, he could see that something was wrong with the aircraft's configuration. The landing gear was only partially extended, one wing appeared to be trailing debris, and the approach angle was steeper than normal. As 77 drew closer, the full extent of the damage became visible, and a collective gasp went up from the personnel gathered to witness the landing. The aircraft looked like it had flown through a metal shredder. Bullet holes stitched across every surface, panels missing or hanging loose, and what appeared to be scorch marks along the fuselage where fires had been extinguished through sheer pilot skill and determination. The final approach was a masterclass in aviation expertise, Blackwood nursing the crippled aircraft toward the runway with microsecond adjustments to throttle and control surfaces. She touched down hard but in control, the aircraft bouncing once before settling onto the concrete with a shower of sparks from the partially collapsed landing gear. Emergency vehicles raced alongside as 77 rolled to a stop just short of the runway's end. As the engines wound down and emergency crews surrounded the aircraft, the canopy opened slowly to reveal a pilot who looked like she had aged years in the past 2 days. Blackwood's flight suit was torn and stained, her face streaked with exhaustion and dried blood, but her eyes remained sharp and focused as she surveyed the organized chaos surrounding her aircraft. Peterson reached the cockpit first, his experienced hands already assessing the mechanical damage while his eyes checked Blackwood for signs of serious injury. "Welcome home, Captain," he said simply, offering his hand to help her climb down from the cockpit. "Hell of a way to make an entrance." Rodriguez arrived moments later, her face a mixture of relief and professional concern as she took in the condition of both pilot and aircraft. Medical personnel were already moving in with stretchers and diagnostic equipment, but Blackwood waved them off with the stubborn independence that had carried her through 60 hours of survival behind enemy lines. "I need to debrief immediately," she told Morrison as the general approached her position. "What I saw out there changes everything we thought we knew about enemy capabilities and intentions." Her voice was hoarse from dehydration and stress, but her manner carried the urgency of someone who had witnessed something significant. Morrison nodded, gesturing toward a waiting vehicle. "Medical evaluation first, then we'll talk. Rodriguez, Peterson, I want a complete assessment of that aircraft. Every hole, every system failure, every piece of damage. The story it tells might be as important as what the pilot has to report." As Blackwood was helped into the ambulance for what would prove to be a perfunctory medical examination, she had survived her ordeal with nothing more serious than dehydration, exhaustion, and minor cuts. Peterson began his detailed inspection of 7-7. What he found would redefine everyone's understanding of both the aircraft's capabilities and the skill of the pilot who had brought it home. The debriefing took place in a secure conference room where maps covered every wall and communication equipment hummed with the constant chatter of military operations. Blackwood sat at the head of a table surrounded by Morrison, Chang, intelligence officers from higher headquarters, and a stenographer whose job was to record every word of what promised to be a significant tactical revelation. The intelligence was wrong about enemy strength and disposition in Sector 7 Alpha, Blackwood began without preamble, her voice steady despite the exhaustion that showed in her posture. "What we thought was a simple supply convoy was actually bait for a complex ambush designed to draw our aircraft into a prepared kill zone." She moved to the map display, pointing to locations with the precision of someone who had memorized every detail during hours of flying at treetop level. "They've established at least 12 surface-to-air missile sites in positions that aren't covered by our reconnaissance assets. Mobile units using natural terrain features for concealment, coordinated through a communications network that's more sophisticated than anything we've encountered before." Chang leaned forward, studying the positions Blackwood was indicating. "How did you acquire this information? The mission briefing indicated you were shot down during your third pass on the convoy." "I was hit," Blackwood confirmed, unconsciously touching a bandaged cut on her forehead. "Lost hydraulic pressure, electrical system was compromised, and the aircraft was handling like it wanted to swap ends. But I managed to maintain control long enough to get clear of the immediate threat area." What followed was a tactical narrative that demonstrated both exceptional pilot skill and a level of battlefield awareness that impressed even veteran combat officers. After being hit, Blackwood had used the smoke and confusion of the engagement to disappear from enemy observation, flying at altitudes so low that she was literally weaving between trees and rock formations. "The northern route was the only option," she continued. "Everything else was covered by SAM sites or fighter patrols, but flying that low, I could see things that don't show up on satellite imagery, camouflaged positions, supply routes, communication installations. They've built a logistics network through those mountains that's been completely invisible to our intelligence assets." The implications were staggering. If Blackwood's observations were accurate, enemy forces had constructed a supply line that could support major operations without detection by conventional reconnaissance methods. The strategic impact went far beyond tactical considerations. It suggested a level of sophistication and long-term planning that would require fundamental changes to operational doctrine. "I need to see the aircraft damage assessment," one of the intelligence officers said. "The pattern of hits, the types of weapons used, the electronic countermeasures employed, all of that will help confirm what we're dealing with." Peterson's maintenance report was waiting when they arrived at Hangar 3, where 77 sat under harsh fluorescent lights that revealed every detail of her ordeal. The aircraft looked like a testament to both engineering resilience and pilot determination. Shot full of holes but somehow still functional, damaged beyond what should have been survivable but clearly capable of completing its mission. 237 separate impact points, Peterson reported, reading from his clipboard. Small arms fire, heavy machine gun rounds, at least one rocket-propelled grenade, and evidence of near misses from 2 different types of surface-to-air missiles. The fact that this aircraft was still flyable represents either remarkable luck or exceptional pilot skill. Rodriguez was examining the cockpit area, noting modifications and adaptations that Blackwood had made during her extended flight through enemy territory. Emergency repairs using flight suit fabric and electrical tape, jury-rigged control connections to compensate for damaged systems, and evidence of in-flight maintenance that would have required both technical knowledge and steady hands while flying at high speed at extremely low altitude. The investigation revealed that 77 had been flying on backup systems for the majority of its journey home. Primary flight controls were compromised, navigation equipment was intermittent, and fuel consumption was nearly 50% higher than normal due to engine damage and the requirement to fly at maximum performance settings to maintain control. Under normal circumstances, the aircraft should have been unflyable. But Raven Blackwood had redefined what was possible, using a combination of technical expertise, tactical awareness, and sheer determination to transform what should have been a catastrophic shoot-down into an intelligence windfall that would reshape the entire operational picture. The transformation in how personnel regarded Blackwood was subtle but unmistakable. The quiet pilot who had arrived 6 months earlier as an unremarkable replacement had proven herself under the most extreme circumstances imaginable. Conversations that had once carried undertones of polite skepticism now reflected genuine respect for someone who had demonstrated exceptional competence when it mattered most. Sullivan found himself reassessing every interaction he had shared with his former wingman, remembering moments when her tactical suggestions had seemed overly cautious or unnecessarily complex. Now those same suggestions appeared to be evidence of deeper understanding, preparation for contingencies that more experienced pilots had dismissed as unlikely. Her methodical approach to mission planning, her obsessive attention to terrain features, her habit of studying enemy tactics long after other pilots had moved on to recreation. It all made sense in the context of what she had accomplished. Chang was revising training protocols based on Blackwood's debriefing, incorporating lessons learned from her navigation of territory that military doctrine considered impassable. The techniques she had employed, ultra-low altitude flying, terrain masking, electronic emissions control, represented a synthesis of theoretical knowledge and practical application that would become standard curriculum for future pilot training. Peterson discovered that his initial assessment of Blackwood as a pilot who treated her aircraft like it was alive had been more accurate than he realized. Her post-flight maintenance logs revealed an understanding of aircraft systems that went beyond operational necessity into genuine mechanical intuition. She didn't just fly the machine, she collaborated with it, adapting her technique to accommodate its limitations while pushing performance boundaries that more conventional pilots never approached. The intelligence gathered during her extended flight through enemy territory proved to be strategically significant beyond initial assessments. Satellite reconnaissance, redirected based on her observations, revealed an entire network of installations that had been hidden through sophisticated camouflage and deception techniques. The supply convoy she had originally been tasked to attack was indeed part of a larger operation.